gang rape going on in English towns night after night, year after year. The one and only Maggie Oliver is here on that. There may be no border at all in the English Channel, but there is a very hard border down the Irish Sea, and Brussels intends to keep it that way. Baroness Hoey is back with us. And, of course, the most important part of the show, that is you. Email me. Ask me anything you'd like. gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can Twitter me at GBNews. A full hour of news and analysis coming your way after Polly Middlehurst with the latest headlines.
Mark, thank you, and good evening to you. The top story tonight on GB News: the suspect in the firebombing of a Dover immigration centre is reported to have been posting anti-Muslim rants on Facebook. Kent Police have named the man as 66-year-old Andrew Leake from High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. He was found dead at a nearby service station after the attack. Counter-terrorism police are now leading the investigation. They say it was likely to have been motivated by some form of hate-filled grievance. Meanwhile, migrants are being removed from the immigration processing centre in Manston in Kent today. At least 2 full coaches left as part of the Home Secretary's plans to relieve pressure on the facility. Around 4,000 people were thought to be housed at Manston, but it was originally built to hold a maximum of 1,600. The former Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, has had the Conservative whip suspended after signing up to do a reality TV show. He's set to appear on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. The series starts this Sunday, but Mr Hancock's expected to be one of 2 latecomers to join camp. Mr Hancock resigned from the Cabinet in June last year after breaching guidance on social distancing. And the campaign group Just Stop Oil say they're pausing protests for the time being to give the government time to reflect on its responsibilities to the country. It comes after the environmental activists tried to climb and lock themselves to the gates of Downing Street. The demonstrators also tried to block Whitehall, some sitting on the road, while others glued themselves to the tarmac. They want the government to halt the granting of all new oil and gas licences. Royal Mail workers will stage a 48-hour strike around Black Friday and then again on Cyber Monday in an escalating row over pay and conditions. Members of the Communications Workers Union will walk out on November the 25th and then again on the 28th. They'll replace strikes originally planned for the 12th and 14th. Royal Mail were made an offer on Monday worth 9% over 2 years. However, the CWU will recommend its members reject it. You're bang up to date on TV, online and DAB+ radio. You're with GB News, where now it's time for Mark Steyn.
Thank you, Polly. So the Royal Mail guys are rejecting a 9% pay increase. Have you been offered a 9% pay increase in these difficult times? Most people are not terribly numerate, so they have a difficult time grasping the significance of numbers. Queue jumpers like Philip Schofield are still all in on the COVID vaccine fairy tale because that's easier than actually looking at the data on not just the terrible harm they've done to many, but on their waning efficacy for those they don't actually kill and injure. Hard, cold numbers can be very useful, especially with regard to the big picture, as with demographics. Demography is destiny. Long ago, I wrote a best-selling book about demography, which is actually very difficult to do. You give it a go. And I said in there that the future belongs to those who show up. And absent any will to repulse it, that's Britain's future showing up on the southern shore every night. Now, were, say, 1,000 Scottish Presbyterians taking small boats to the east coast of Ulster every night, we would certainly hear about it on the BBC because Irish Republicans would grasp its demographic significance. You may have noticed a slew of news stories about shifting demographics in Northern Ireland. Take a look at this. For the first time, the census shows more Catholics than Protestants. And suddenly, the British media gets very excited by demographics because at the Beeb and elsewhere, they dislike unionism and have been waiting half a century or more to dance on its grave. We'll get into that with Kate Hoey a little later. But demographics in the UK as a whole doesn't excite the Republican romantics of the London media looking at the world through their shamrock-hued spectacles half so much. On Saturday night, a supposed 990 quote-unquote asylum seekers landed on the southern shore. 1,000 people doesn't sound a lot in a nation of 67 million, but for purposes of comparison, there were 624,828 babies born in England and Wales last year. These are the official statistics from the Office for National Statistics. That is rather a low figure because Anglo-Welsh women seem to be losing the maternal urge. But it equals 1,712 newborn babes a day versus 990 Albanians and Somalis and whatnot washing up on the southern shore. So those folks arriving by dinghy every night are equivalent to about 58% of England and Wales's natural population growth through the old-fashioned method of new babies every day. So how many days does that have to go on before Britain's future starts trending very Albanian? We'll get into that with our stats man, Jamie Jenkins. There are consequences to demographic transformation. We call it diversity and multiculturalism, which are in fact morally neutral concepts, but which under the relentless propaganda of our times are sold to us as virtues. Nice cuddly things that all nice cuddly people are all in favour of. Not so long ago, being born poor in a deprived neighbourhood in an English town was a tough break, but you could survive it and even perhaps overcome it. Now there's a demographic wrinkle to that too. Culture trumps economics every time. And if you're living alongside a culture that regards you and your friends as degenerate infidel whores and thus fair game, now, in addition to grinding poverty, your burden includes gang rape and sex slavery. We'll get into that with Maggie Oliver, one of the very few public figures in this country to speak honestly about this terrible issue. Giving the tens of thousands of little girls whose lives have been ruined in almost every English town of any size, given the immense amount of human wreckage piled up by our disgustingly corrupt politicians, social workers and policemen, it would seem somewhat imprudent, to put it at its mildest, to keep bringing in young men for whom there are no available women. Yet that's what's happening under what we laughably regard as our immigration policy. Thanks to the dishonest presentation of this story by the media, there's a very nice fellow on Dubes & Co. talking in this way. People seem to think these are refugee families fleeing persecution in France, Italy, whatever. They're not families. Here's a graph made by the aforementioned Jamie Jenkins from the official Home Office statistics. Look over on the right-hand side. 87% are men. 87% are men. And 3/4 of those men are aged 18 to 39. If you're a 12-year-old girl in Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, Telford, you might want to invest in a new pair of sneakers. What would you call 1,000 men of military age coming ashore every night? The Home Secretary called it, quote, an invasion, as it would have been described at any other point in British history. Just this year, for example, enough men have arrived on the southern shore that it's actually about twice the number of men who arrived, who were dispatched by the King of Spain in the Spanish Armada. This time it's not a foreign king dispatching a foreign army, but it is a foreign criminal enterprise. Very lucrative business, human smuggling, particularly now that they're using the ludicrously misnamed Border Force and the Royal National Lifeboat Institution as their subcontractors helpfully improving the foreign criminals' bottom line by sticking most of the transportation costs to the British taxpayer. So Suella Braverman was quite right to call it an invasion. She hasn't repulsed a single dinghy. She hasn't deported a single Albanian. But simply because she talks butch, the media and the awful, hollow, unprincipled squishes of the Tory party, the men and women who have utterly destroyed conservatism in any meaningful sense, are demanding that she be fired. The correct Tory position on the nightly invasion is apparently that of Lord Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen. You put the telescope to your blind eye and say, "I see no dinghies." Because Mrs. Braverman is a braver man than her colleagues, she sees the dinghies and has said so, so now she has to go. Here are the top stories over at The Spectator today. Headline: Why Sunak would find it tough to lose Braverman. Headline: Why Sunak shouldn't sack Suella Braverman. Headline: Could Robert Jenrick end up replacing Suella Braverman? Headline: The Tories are addicted to self-destruction. Well, that one's certainly true. Let me know what you think. GBViews at gbnews.uk. Toby Young, founder of both The Daily Sceptic and the Free Speech Union, is back with us. What do you make of this attack on Suella, Toby?
Very disappointing, Mark, and I'm praying that Rishi Sunak doesn't do the bidding of all those people calling for him to sack Suella. Whenever you turn on the BBC, you know, the running theme is questions are still being asked about the future of Suella Braverman, as if it's not the BBC asking those questions and they're just reporting on it in a completely impartial and neutral way. And I think the reason she has been targeted, the reason she's a victim of this witch hunt, is because she's actually said she wants to do something about the small boats crossing the channel every day. She's talked tough. And that's not popular. Even using the word invasion has prompted accusations of racism. I mean, when someone compares illegal migrants to invaders, I think of, you know, Germans or Spaniards or even Vikings. And I don't think of it as being a particularly racist analogy. I mean, why is it racist to compare someone to a Dane? So I don't really buy the idea that she's not morally fit to be our Home Secretary, because she takes this constant influx of illegal migrants seriously and has vowed to do something about it. That's, I think, why she's got into so much difficulty, and that's why I hope Rishi Sunak stands by her.
Well, just wearing your Free Speech Union hat for a moment, it's interesting. You've done a lot on cancel culture and standing up for people to say this and say that. We're actually now getting to the stage where the media are telling us what words we can and can't use. So last week, globalism was supposedly anti-Semitic. Now the word invasion is racist. This isn't a small thing, because if you actually keep shrinking the vocabulary, people literally do not have the words available to discuss what's actually going on.
Yes, I do think that's behind a lot of the language policing we see by the woke left. They want to rob us of the vocabulary to describe the world as it is, so we aren't able to draw attention to the fact that their vision of the world, their values, are so at odds with what we can see in front of our own eyes. And you see that in particular with the policing of language around gender and the insistence that we refer to trans women as women. You know, you're not allowed to say what you can see with your eyes standing right in front of you, because if you are, then you're able to point out that a lot of their views are completely at odds with reality.
Well, reality here is getting more and more visible. I mean, there's apparently some plan somewhere in the Home Office for building tent cities of these Albanian asylum seekers in the central London parks, in Hyde Park and Green Park. The royal parks of London are going to become encampments. At that point, the British people are being asked who you're going to believe, me or your lying eyes. I mean, this is a bedrock issue for Tory voters, and it is bizarre the way no Tory ministry has actually been prepared to take it on and solve the problem.
Well, if the migrants are housed in the thousands in Hyde Park and Green Park and St James's Park, then actually the government might sit up and take notice and do something about it. It's largely because most illegal migrants are shipped off to far-flung parts of the country and kept out of London unless they're employed as domestic cleaners or childminders or as low-level service personnel in restaurants and pubs. And so they're out of sight for the most part. I think if they were housed in a tent city in some of our beautiful royal parks, I think finally something might actually be done.
So that might be. They do penetrate deep into. I mean, I saw some communication today from a fellow in Worcester, which is a long way from the southern shore, saying there's some nice country house hotel in Worcestershire which is now full of migrants. I mean, people regard this as a betrayal. People who voted for Brexit didn't vote for Brexit with open borders, Toby. The Tory party surely needs to get real on that.
No, they voted on the understanding that voting for Brexit would enable us to take back control of, among other things, our borders. And the Conservative Party have singularly failed to deliver on that promise. It was a promise in the 2019 Conservative manifesto. They were going to reduce immigration. David Cameron, even before Brexit, said he wanted to bring annual net migration down to tens of thousands, a target he never even got close to achieving. And Suella Braverman is being targeted because she's practically the only member of the cabinet who says, I take this manifesto pledge seriously. I think we should deliver on what we promised to do and what people voted for us to do. And that, for some reason, is very unpopular, not just with The Guardian and the BBC, but also with some members of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. It's shocking.
Yeah, and I think the other thing, Toby, is that Suella actually regards this as being symbolic of the perceived impotence of the so-called Conservative government actually to affect anything. You can't go around telling people, vote for us, we're impotent. That, at a certain point, particularly fourth time round in the cycle, that ceases to have any kind of appeal. Toby Young, thank you very much. We appreciate your view, as always. It's always great to see you. We've been talking about demographics tonight, which Mrs. Braverman surely understands. Let me just give a very obvious example. On Saturday night, in the capital city of South Korea, 156 people were crushed to death during some sort of Halloween event. That's a tragedy in any terms, but it has an additional poignancy if you know that most of the dead were young, because South Korea can't afford to lose any young people. It's running out of them. It has one of the lowest birth rates on the planet. South Korea is a highly prosperous, highly advanced society. Many years ago at the Pentagon, the then US Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, showed me a photograph at the Korean Peninsula at night that he liked to pull out to make a point. Here it is. This is what Donald Rumsfeld pulled out of his jacket pocket and showed me. That bit with all the lights blazing is South Korea. That great slab of total darkness atop it is North Korea. It's in the dark because Kim Jong-un has the one working light bulb. As Rummy saw it, it's not hard to figure which half of Korea is the future and which half is doomed. But look at this. This is the population distribution of the two Koreas. Now, if you see on the left, that's North Korea. North Korea has half the population of South Korea, but it's a lot younger. Zero in on that big fat bulge at the bottom. That's all the babies and toddlers and kindergartners and primary school kids. Now shift over to the right side. That's South Korea, completely different population distribution. Their big bulge is up near the top. That's 50, 60, 7-year-olds. 70-year-olds. But look at that thin band down at the bottom. There are way fewer babies, toddlers, kindergartners. North Korea is a one-man psycho-state that produces nothing except cheap knockoff Viagra of uncertain reliability, and incompetent nuclear weapons, also of uncertain reliability. They rarely land anywhere near their intended target. But North Korea has a future, and South Korea is going out of business. What of our own fair islands? The latest UK census is released tomorrow. Our statsman Jamie Jenkins is here to preview it. Jamie, let's get something out of the way up front. They're no longer going to report people by country of origin or births by to non-UK born mothers. People seem to think that that's a rather sinister omission. What do you make of it?
Yeah, good evening, Mark. So basically what that is that the ONS compile, they rely on some data from the Department for Work and Pensions on kind of work visas, and that kind of isn't very fit for purpose at the moment. So what they're going to do is they're going to release imminently the population across the country. We'll have the country of birth figures as well as part of that. And they're looking to improve the methodology in terms of getting more up-to-date, accurate measures as we go away from the census over the next 10 years. So I wouldn't read into anything too sinister with regard to that there, Mark. I think it's just the case of that the figures that they are compiling at the moment, they're not really fit for purpose. And the census kind of, when we get the new figures from there, will update, and that will kind of replace all the figures we've had before.
Well, you'll recall earlier this year, I think it was the end of January, we suddenly stopped getting the numbers of hospitalization and death according to vaccination status, because I think in January it had started at 20%, then gone up to 40%, then gone up to 50%, then gone up to 75% of the deaths were triple vaccinated, and they suddenly say, oh, we're not going to record that anymore. So you're confident that there's not some kind of political reason for the omission of these numbers?
No, I think the vaccine stats just kind of came from the UK Health Statistics Agency, which kind of comes under the umbrella of the Department of Health there, Mark. So there may be something that went on there, but the ONS, I used to work there, obviously, as you know, they're kind of impartial. They're kind of divorced slightly away from governments. I don't think there's anything issue. I've looked at the statement that they've released. I don't think there's anything sinister going on, and I just think that it's a case of the figures that they were publishing weren't really accurate. The census figures that are imminently coming out, they'll be more up to date, and they're probably going to show, Mark, that we're going to see more and more people who are born, obviously, abroad living in the UK. We know that over the last 10 years, we've had an increase of about 3.5 million people in the England and Wales population. A big chunk of those over the age of 65 as well. When you look at the aging thing, the two graphics you've just shown there, looking at North Korea and South Korea. South Korea is kind of a pretty much an issue across most of the Western world, in that people are having fewer births. It's the housing prices, cost of living. People are still living with their parents well into their 30s, whereas in the past they would have had children. And the problem is you've got this ticking time bomb of more and more older people and not many younger people coming through to replace them. So that is a big issue for all the Western countries. And I think you brought it to light there in those graphics.
Well, let me ask you about that, because the basis of a social democratic society, somewhere like Sweden or Denmark, is that, say, young Danes will be willing to support elderly Danes as they retire. That's the premise of our welfare societies since the Second World War. And that gets more difficult if there are fewer and fewer young Danes to support the older Danes. But what if you have a situation like such as the United Kingdom? Is there sufficient social solidarity that all these Albanians and Somalis and Eritreans arriving on the southern shore every night, are they going to be willing to support Wilfred and Gwyneth in their old age throughout England and Wales?
Well, the first problem you got, Mark, is that obviously we've just hit now, if you look over the weekend, the number of people coming across on small boats has actually hit nearly approaching 40,000, and that's actually more now than every single year before 2022. That's the first thing that's probably worth bringing home. Now, the vast majority of those now, they're going to take ages to get actually kind of going through the system, and they can't actually produce any kind of money for the UK exchequer because they can't work until they've been processed. That's another big issue that we've got. And then the biggest issue of all, I suppose, Mark, is that when you look at people think, oh, I paid in all my life. That's what people always say. Well, I should get my benefits. I should get my pension. I paid in all my life. What the pensioners need to realise is that the governments that they were paying their money to over the last 20, 30, 40 years didn't put any money away like you pay into your private pension pot. None of that money's been put away. It was kind of all spent to kind of provide for the day of what they were presenting their tax at the time. So at the moment, we haven't got enough younger people to pay the tax to pay for all these pensions of the older people. So the big debate for Rishi Sunak and the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt over the next few weeks is whether or not to keep the triple lock. Now, that is a big issue for the government, Mark, because as you say, we got more and more people over the last kind of 10 years. We've seen 2.2 million more people over the age of 65. Most of those draw on their pension. Can we afford to pay for all this? This is a ticking time bomb. And the social care problem we got, Mark, no government can solve it because no government can even touch it.
Well, wouldn't it be better for us to at least make it easier for people to have more children rather than, say, the nightly landings on the southern shore, as I said earlier, are now equivalent to about 60% of all the babies born in England and Wales? Wouldn't it be more advantageous to make it easier for English and Welsh families to have more kids?
No, you're bang on there, Mark. But when I was at the ONS, I worked with a number of teams there, and you do track kind of the changing patterns across the last 10 or 20 years. And what you've got is that people who are younger can't get on the housing ladder, or there's not enough housing stock for them to get kind of on the housing ladder. Even local authorities aren't providing enough housing stock. So people who are kind of meet each other, they want to set up a family, well, they can't do that because what you tend to find is more and more people are living until their mid-30s with their parents, and then they may manage to get enough money for a deposit to get a home, and then they might have their first child. But because that's kind of been delayed 5 to 10 years, they're only having one child, and then the total fertility rate across the country, Mark. So for the viewers and listeners, that's if you need 2.1 children for each couple to replace everybody who's going to obviously sadly die at the end of their lives. But we're much, much below that. Ironically, Mark, it's the migrants who are coming in who've got a high fertility rate. So you've got kind of migrants coming in and they're having more children. They're actually keeping the total fertility rate across the country up at the moment. So that's kind of what's going on. It's the big cost of living crisis, which is going to get worse. It wouldn't surprise me, Mark, if we see fewer children for the UK population now over the next 5 to 10 years as well.
No, I think you're right there. I mean, I loved my parents, but the idea of living with them to my basically till early middle age, they wouldn't have put up with it, and I certainly couldn't have stuck it. So I think a lot of young Britons who can't get their own houses are actually going to be leaving the country and finding lusher pastures elsewhere. Thank you very much, Jamie. Always great to have you with us. Coming up, we'll get to your thoughts, gbviews@gbnews.uk, and Maggie Oliver on the ongoing sacrifice of our young girls in the industrial-scale rape towns of England. Kate Hoey is here on the wedge the EU has driven through our union. All coming up. Don't go anywhere.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
My name's Tom Harwood, and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for The Briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, The Briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
We are GB News, right across the nation. You can get us on television, on radio, on digital. We're absolutely everywhere.
Amazing! You see, amazing!
You remind me of me in the European Parliament. But here's the most important bit. We are not part of the mainstream establishment. We think and speak just like you do. We are the People's Channel.
Magnificent. That's really, really thoughtful.
Come and join us on GB News, the People's News Channel.
GB News is the People's Channel, so let's hear what the people have to say. We wanted to know how long you thought Mrs. Braverman would survive with her views on the migrant invasion. Andy says, hopefully more than 2 years, and by that time the boats will have slowed to a trickle, and the millions spent on hotel bills can be spent on those in the UK in most need. Stuart says she ain't done anything yet, just words. Michael, yeah, it's interesting, just words, but that's enough for them to be calling for her to be sacked because they figure the word should mean something. Michael says, if I had my way, she'd stay until she has the border mess sorted once and for all, but with 80% of those in Parliament being Remoaners and 90% of the MSM also being in favour of the EU, what chance does she have beyond Friday? The clock is ticking. Did you hear about the final report of Alexis Jay's independent inquiry into child sexual abuse? No? Oh, you do surprise me. The inquiry took 7 years to do, so that's, let me just run the arithmetic, 112 times the length of Liz Truss's premiership, and indeed twice as long as Boris Johnson's. But the final report came out and sank without trace, almost as if the British state would rather these déclassé riffraff from the unfashionable part of town would just go back to being gang raped without making a big deal about it. Maggie Oliver founded the Maggie Oliver Foundation, and she's one of the very few people in these islands who does make a big deal about it. Maggie, do you think these reports, these inquiries, We've had a decade's worth of them now. Do you think they've actually had any effect, or are they complete waste of time at this stage?
I think when you're talking about the ICSA report, I think I've made it very clear that when you're looking at the organised network strand, it was called, the grooming gangs, I was one of the core participants. I don't believe it was worth the paper it was written on. I went into it hoping, because it was Alexis J and she knew what had gone on in Rotherham, that this time it would be different. But right from the very start, Mark, and I worked on that for 2 years, as did other people who work on the ground with children who have been raped on this scale. I went into it hoping that they would look at the truth, but they didn't allow one single town from the north of England to be included. They allowed one victim to be interviewed. They filled 10 days with 90% of the 10 days was spent giving a platform to senior police officers and senior social workers who I would say are responsible for all these children having been failed over decades. People like me, people like Parents Against Child Exploitation, Harriet Wistrich from the Centre for Women's Justice. We know what's going on. Victims were excluded. My statement was decimated from 58 pages to 18. We were not allowed to speak. We were silenced. So, no, I think it was a waste of public money. It took 7 years, and they came out with 3 recommendations, not obligations, recommendations, all of which you would assume were already being done. So if you're a teacher and you know a child is being sexually abused in your class, you do something about it. You shouldn't need a law to tell you that you need to do that. So, you know, it really, for me, was a waste of money, a waste of time, and I really fear for the future of children in these towns and cities, because very little is really changing.
Well, that nice lady from the New Zealand High Court, who I think was the first chairman in this particular inquiry, she basically left. We all know this. She won't actually say it within the United Kingdom, because I think she got a hell of a shock at how corrupt, from a Kiwi point of view, the mother country was. But she got out of there because she figured that the main point of this report was just to take a long time so it could all be swept gradually under the carpet and nothing would be done to the people who enabled it to happen.
I think you're right, Mark, and I think it's because of people like me, like CWJ, you know, and victims who constantly keep the spotlight on this, and people like you who will not let it go away, because there is no doubt in my mind that the authorities would like it to fade away. But it's not going to. The losers all the time are the children who are being let down and silenced. And whether it's Rotherham or Rochdale or Telford or Oxford, the facts are the same. The authorities are not charging the right offences. The offenders are getting out of prison after having a slap on the wrist. They are meant to be deported, and they get 10 years of, you know, legal aid fighting deportation. The victims are the ones that are always the very last in line. And I want to see changes. I want to see action. And when we get, you know, we had Rishi Sunak, we've had Suella Braverman, we've had Liz Truss, all talking about these grooming gangs when they were up for re-election. Suddenly we've got a deathly silence. So when is action going to follow words and promises? Because it's not going away, and the cat is out of the bag now, Mark. So the country is up in arms about it. It is politicians that need to act and do something. And we're not going away until something is done. And it's not just the police. It is the CPS as well. It is the court system. It is the legal aid. Right. It is the whole gravy train, which is not doing the job that they are paid to do.
Well, just to go back to what you were talking about just there, because this is a case you know well, in Rochdale, we're all supposed to be excited that Adil Khan and Kari Abdul Rauf were, after 10 years of appeals, they're now going to be deported back to Pakistan. But 93%, that's a kind of estimate that you can pretty much take to the bank. 93% of these cases and 93% of the perpetrators are still walking around Rochdale, Rotherham, Telford, Oxford, Aylesbury, Banbury, on and on.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll talk about Rochdale because I think the country understands Rochdale because of the drama, but that is going on in every town and city. When you look at Rochdale, when you look at Adil Khan, he was the man who got a 13-year-old child pregnant. We had a fetus, DNA proved he was the person responsible. The CPS chose not to charge that man with rape. He was out of prison in 3 years. 10 years on, he is still milking the system, fighting deportation. And can you believe it? He is arguing that he wants to be a role model for his own children, that he is entitled to a family life. Well, I am sorry, when somebody does what he did, he abdicates his rights. The rights of the child and of the victim should supersede his. And we've got the whole thing topsy-turvy. He should not still be here. He should have been deported the moment he walked out of the prison gates. And in fact, in my opinion, he should be in prison now. If he was in America, he would have been serving a whole, you know, catalogue of life sentences for what he did. He's never said he was sorry. He should not have been given parole. He showed no remorse. And he continues to say that he's been treated unfairly. So the failures, it is always the victims. And his victim, who he got pregnant when she was just 13, never knew he was even out of prison until she walked round the end of the aisle in Asda and came face to face with him in unsupervised contact. He was with another child in his company. We went to safeguarding about it. They would do nothing. He was under no obligation to stay out of Rochdale. So he is exploiting a system that allows him to do that. So we need radical changes in the laws, in the way the system works, in how these abusers, these paedophiles, are allowed to continue to, you know, to carry on their lives as though they've done nothing wrong, Mark. And it still makes my blood boil after all these years that it's still going on.
No, that should make everybody's blood boil. This guy, Adil Khan, he's in his 50s now. So he was a middle-aged man when he raped and impregnated a 13-year-old girl who, as you say, is expected just to get on with her life, walk into the supermarket, see him in the next aisle with another victim. This is a disgrace. It's a national shame, and you're one of the few people doing anything about it, Maggie, with your foundation. We're going to stay on this story and keep on at it, because the silence of our political class and these worthless municipalities, as you say, it's not just the coppers, it's the prosecution service, it's the bureaucracy, it's the politicians are willing. I said the other day, I was talking about that famous line about the Irish Troubles, when the Home Office cynically said, oh, we'll hold it down to an acceptable level of violence. This is even more cynical. We're holding it down to an acceptable level of child gang rape, and it's disgusting. Thank you very much, Maggie. It's always an honour to have you on. Stump the Steyn looms. You can ask me anything at GBView at gbnews.uk, and Baroness Hoey is here on Where Stands the Union, coming up.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
Every Saturday at 2 o'clock, join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain. I'm not afraid to give you a platform and say it how it is.
Come on, make the case. Something like this is very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flock at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
For helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV.
On radio.
And online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
We've been doing a lot of statistics on tonight's show, so here's a couple more. You know this Northern Ireland Protocol, under which one of our 4 home nations remains in the EU single market, and thus domestic goods going from one corner of the UK to another have to undergo customs checks if they ever go across the sea to Belfast. Well, courtesy of a report by the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, we learn, quote, 20% of all customs checks carried out in the EU take place on goods crossing the Irish Sea, even though just 0.2% of goods entering the single market arrive via that route. So the Irish border, the Irish Sea customs checks between Britain and Northern Ireland now have more customs checks than any half-dozen EU member nations. It's almost like Brussels is using the pretext of the single market to teach Britain a lesson. Lady Hoey is back with us. Kate, this is more relevant, isn't it, than all the protocol negotiations, because it shows that there's a punitive aspect to this.
I think the figures are actually shocking. The idea that for that tiny amount of trade that is coming across from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, and then that a very, very tiny part of that might just go on into the European Union's single market in the Republic of Ireland, means that 20% of all their checks are going into this little bit, this little corner of the whole of the so-called wonderful European Union. It is shocking, and it's getting that kind of statistic out is really important, because most people don't really understand the detail, and this gives it a very clear focus, because every individual in Northern Ireland is affected daily because you can't get things, or things are more expensive coming over.
No, and in fact, businesses, I mean, it's not just a hypothetical thing or a bureaucratic thing. It actually adds hundreds of pounds to every pallet of goods crossing between Britain and Ulster and Britain.
Yes, it adds to the costs. It adds to the bureaucracy. I mean, we've met people who literally held up hundreds of pages of documents that they've had to fill in to be able to send something across to their own country, and yet no one seems to think that that's. No one in the European Union seems to think that that is certainly gone against what even I'm sure Boris Johnson thought that the protocol would mean. I mean, those of us who warned against it could see that there was going to be difficulties, but I think the way the European Union has brought it in is just made the situation so much worse, and businesses now are refusing to send things to Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland citizens are having to look elsewhere, and that's obviously pleasing the Irish government, because quite a lot of stuff now is being sourced from the Republic. So there's a diversion of trade, which of course within the protocol, Article 16 said one of the things that shouldn't happen was that diversion of trade, and it's happening daily. So we're still in the middle of the protocol bill going through the House of Lords. We've had 2 days, we've got a third day tomorrow and a fourth day next week. And I'm afraid it's all going to end up, when we get to report stage with votes, with a very large number of peers amending it so that it ends up being completely hopeless, and will then go back to the Commons, and Rishi Sunak will have to decide, does he care about the Union, does he care about the Northern Ireland, or does he care more about keeping the EU happy?
Well, you know, it's a basic rule of negotiation that you don't get into a bad faith negotiation. And the fact that they've installed this level of so-called customs checks in the Irish Sea shows that from the European point of view, this has always been bad faith. And in that sense, the government should, which is a pretty big player. I know it doesn't behave like one, but it's still a G7 nation. It's still part of the permanent five at the UN. Why doesn't it just tell the EU to take a hike on all this rubbish?
Well, of course, we've got the Parliament full of lawyers who go on about international law and breaking treaties. I mean, my view on that is that the Belfast Agreement was an international treaty. It came first. And if you've got two treaties that are actually in contradiction, then you go for the one that stands up for your own citizens in your own country. And I'm afraid there are some of my colleagues who seem to want to help and support the EU more than the United Kingdom. And of course, we're still in grace periods, these periods that were allowed for some things not to be quite implemented fully. Now, those grace periods, if they end, it's been again made very clear that it's actually going to really, really stop much of our trade coming over from Great Britain. So, we're not. And the other worrying thing, of course, Mark, at the moment is that, within the unionist loyalist community, there is real anger and frustration, and we're in a situation where we're now in limbo. The Parliament isn't working, and the Secretary of State keeps changing his mind about whether there's going to be another election or not. And the situation is people are warning that it is very, very dangerous what's happening. So I think the government needs to. They've got a lot of things on their plate, and we know that, but the protection of Northern Ireland, their own citizens, and protection of the Union should be pretty high up, I would say, their agenda.
Well, they're mocking Britain in Brussels, aren't they? They're teaching them the lesson that if you're determined to leave the European Union, we're going to screw you over. And they're doing that in case any of these Central and Eastern member nations were to start showing little Brexity signs. So we know why they're doing that. We just don't understand why London is basically just lying there and taking it from these guys.
I think that's what makes me very, very angry. I've seen over a number of years our own government refusing to stand up for Northern Ireland. The Irish government stands up all the time for nationalists in Northern Ireland, and our own government keeps pretending that they sort of have to be neutral. And of course, they don't have to be neutral at all. And the government isn't certainly neutral. And that's the kind of thing that over and over again, we just feel that we are being slowly abandoned. And I think someday somebody will waken up and realise, I hope, that what they're doing is actually very, very damaging to the whole of the Union of the United Kingdom. And again, the promises are made, but we keep saying we need action. It's a bit like the Suella Braverman case and the migrants coming in. Words are wonderful, but we need action, and we need action on the protocol.
You're absolutely right, Kate. We're going to have more on this because it's important. Thank you very much for joining us. We got time, I think, just to stump it out. Oh, look at this one. Helen, Mark, I love the poppy you are wearing. Where did you get it? Well, most of my colleagues are wearing poppies from the Royal British Legion. This is a poppy from the land of my birth, from the Royal Canadian Legion, because it's worth remembering that we fought these two epic struggles of the 20th century as one great imperial family. So when you listen to all this rubbish about anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, the British Empire was the only thing that stood in defence of freedom between the fall of, I think it was the fall of France and Pearl Harbor when the Americans came in. So tell them to screw off with the anti-imperialism. That'll do it. Dan Wootton's here to titillate you Tuesday. What you got, Dan?
And a beautiful poppy it is, Mark Steyn. Have to say, what women you spoilt us with tonight. Kate Hoey and, my goodness, Maggie Oliver. She's just a heroine, isn't she? I could listen to her for hours. We've got a big show coming up. Superstar panel in the house. Amanda Patel, Calvin Robinson and Rebecca Reed. Plus Lady Colin Campbell and Phil Dampier on the Royals tonight too, Mark. So it's all coming up.
Fantastic. I always loved Lady Colin, Dan. She's worth the price of admission all by itself. Best 2 hours on telly, all coming up with Dan after the weather. Stay safe, stay free.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England,
Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
On radio.
and online.
We're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's
News channel.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Dubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out